So we're going on now in the Ran, where he talks about the king and the woman who just got married. So the king and the woman who just got married, they wash their faces on Yom Kippur. The king, it's explained in the Gemara that the reason he has permission to wash on Yom Kippur is based on a pasuk. It says, "A king, your eyes shall see the king in his beauty." And the kala is allowed to wash in order that she does not become like degraded in her husband's eyes. The chaya can put on a sandal, because the cold is difficult for her. The implication being that there's some danger to the chaya for not wearing a proper shoe, proper footwear. So
this means that people walked barefoot on Yom Kippur.
Yeah, actually we'll see a little bit more in the Gemara. They do talk about other kinds of footwear, but what we'll see eventually is that probably most people, or many people, would have gone barefoot, or they would have. They did make footwear out of other materials like
plastic.
Well, the cheap materials that they might have used in their day, like
Coke, I think.
Or they could have taken something from like wicker, like reeds or something like that to make footwear. But we'll see this in the Gemara later, that you would surmise, at least I surmise, that these other kinds of footwear, unlike the kinds of artificial footwear that we have nowadays, they probably didn't use often, and they probably weren't as comfortable, and they weren't really a substitute for wearing a leather shoe. So we'll see more of that eventually. So if you remember, in the Mishnah, which I don't have here, 1 second, just bring it up quickly, just so that it's clear in everybody's head. We had a question when we learned the Mishnah, and the question was how to understand the machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. And what was their machloket? So here, the Mishnah says, Yom Kippurim, Asur ba'achila v'shtiya v'ritmitza v'sicha v'niyat sandal v'tashmish hamita. So that's the first line, and that's what we've been concentrating on. Now we're going to hear, V'melech v'kala yechatzu et peneihem. That's one piska. V'hachaya tinot sandal. That's another piska. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. V'chachamim osrim. So when we read the Mishnah, what's the question that we have, just in terms of reading the Mishnah? What's not clear?
Which in the wing Rabbi Eliezer is allowing, and which ones the Chachamim are rejecting?
Correct. So what are the options? Let's say with Rabbi Eliezer, we have two possibilities, right? We have the inui that he's speaking about right before is nilata sandal in regards to chaya. So let's say it's clear that Rabbi Eliezer permits the chaya to wear a sandal. That seems to be clear. What's not clear?
Whether he also permits the melech and the kala to wash.
So that's one way of asking it. Does Rabbi Eliezer refer back to all of these or just to the second one? And then Chachamim Osrin, then we would have the same question, right? In other words,
על מה הם אוסרים? What are
Exactly.
the so, yeah. Mhm.
what do they say is asur? So what are the options?
At minimum, I'm assuming that they would be, they would asur what Rebbe Eliezer is permitting.
Okay. Well, in other words, that's clear. Whatever Rabbi Eliezer is saying is permitted, that's what the Chachamim are saying is forbidden.
And so the question is whether they're also applying this to the other.
And what's the other?
Whatever Rabbi Eliezer is.
No. We can be specific. So we have two categories of things. We have people that are allowed to wash and people that are allowed to wear shoes.
Okay, so at a minimum, they are applying it to the chaya.
Right, because that's
And then the question, and then the question is
what
whether they're
given
also
to-
applying it to the melech and the kala.
Okay, so let's just break that down a little bit further. We'll make sure we understand it. So if Rabbi Eliezer himself is only going out of his way to permit the chaya to wear a sandal, and then it says chachamim osrin, so that means the chachamim are only oser nilata sandal for the chaya. And then what does everybody think about hamelch v'kala yechatzu et pneihem?
It would be allowed.
It would be allowed. In other words, everybody. So that then we would read the Mishnah like this. We'd say hamelch v'kala yechatzu et pneihem, full stop, and less mandapalik. Nobody disagrees with that. That's part of the Stam Mishnah, and that would be something that everyone agrees upon. And then we get to the next part of the Mishnah. It says Achayati no tasandar divrei Rabbi Eliezer v'chachamim osrim. So that means the only machloket they have is regarding the lata sandal, or alternatively, both of these categories, the melech v'kala and the chaya, are both things that Rabbi Eliezer permits, and that the chachamim, when they say chachamim osrim, it means that they say both of those things are asur. So now let's look at the Ran. So the Ran brings Tosos here, v'kasvu v'tosos, v'katvu b'tosafot. The Misafka le Rabbi Yitzchak, the Rabbeinu Yitzchak. Rabbeinu Yitzchak, who's one of the Balei Tosfot, was not sure I chachamim de'osrin b'matnitin kaimi amelech b'kala olo. The chachamim that are oser in the Mishnah, are they referring to the king and the kala or not? Right, so this is our question. So he says it's a safek, it's not clear from the Mishnah what the chachamim are oser. So what difference does it make? The nafka lamina, right? So there's a nafka mina, there's a difference, it's a practical difference. Mishum dekaimel and karabanan, because we hold like the Rabbanan. In other words, the general halachic rule is that we hold by the chachamim in a machloket with a dat yachid, right, with a single opinion. And so here, if I have to paskin based on the Mishnah, I need to know if the Chachamim are osrim the chaya, just the chaya, or also are they also oser the melech and the kala? V'i lo kaima amelech v'kala mutarin hein l'chotz b'neihem b'yom kippurim. So if the Chachamim are not referring to the king and the kala, then the king and the kala would be permitted to wash their faces on Yom Kippur. V'i kaimi, but if they are referring to the king and the kala, asurim, then they would be forbidden to wash. The kayim malan karabanan, because we hold like the rabbanan. So for Rabbeinu Yitzchak, this was a safek. He didn't know which way to go. The Ram goes on to say, "Val Rabbeinu Hananel Zal Pasaka Rebbe Eliezer." So Rabbeinu Hananel, unexpectedly perhaps, he paskins like Rebbe Eliezer. Mishum damorai mafarshim milte b'shakilu b'taru adibe. Rabbeinu Hananel holds halacha is like Rebbe Eliezer because, as we'll see later in the Gemara, the Amoraim explain his words. They explain Rebbe Eliezer, and then they discuss. They go back and forth. There's a shakla v'targa, according to Rebbe Eliezer, Kedita b'Gemara, as we'll see as we see in the Gemara. So the idea is that when Rishonim came to paskin from the Gemara, right? So as we know, the Gemara rarely paskins. So how do we know which way to paskin halacha from the Gemara? So Rabbeinu Yitzchak starts with this general rule. The general rule is that based on just the source itself, the Mishnah itself, we have a machloket Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer. So we always paskin like the Rabbanan. We go like the Chachamim neged the Yachid. But there's another rule that Rishonim held by, which is if the Gemara takes a lot of time to discuss a particular opinion, that indicates that that's the opinion that they hold by. Because otherwise, why would they take the time to discuss it at length? So Rabbeinu Hananel says, since we see that the Gemara spends a lot of time discussing Rabbi Eliezer, it must be that the Amoraim held like Rabbi Eliezer. Which means, so if we hold like Rabbi Eliezer, then what would halacha be? So let's break it down. For the melech, and that we have two categories. We have the melech hakala to wash, and we have the chaya to wear a sandal. So if we say halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, so then what about each category? Can the king and the kala wash according to Rabbi Eliezer?
It's not clear.
No, it is clear.
They would both be permitted.
Right. How do you know that Rabbi Eliezer is going to permit the king and the kala?
Because either they're not debating that at all, in which case it's permitted, or they are debating it, and Rabbi Eliezer says it's permitted.
Exactly. In other words, once I say halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, I don't have to answer the question. The original question is, does Rabbi Eliezer refer to the king and the kala or just to the chaya? If I say that if I start by telling you halacha is that they're all permitted, then once I know that, or even if I tell you that the chaya is permitted, then I will have reason to believe, not just reason to believe, then I'll know that they're all permitted for the reasons that Michael Schwartz just said. Either Rabbi Eliezer is referring simply to the Chaya, and halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, so the Chaya is permitted. And so if he wasn't referring then to the Melech v'Kala, but the Mishnah says that the Melech and Kala are permitted, so it means everybody holds that they're permitted. So Miman Nafshach, either way, you'll be permitted. So according to Rabbeinu Hananel, he doesn't necessarily answer the question of which part Rabbi Eliezer said and which was just the Stam Mishnah. But for halachic purposes, it doesn't matter because halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore all of them are permitted. This would also seem to be the opinion of Rav Alfasi, because in the halachot, in other words, in his book, in the Rif, he brings what the Amoraim had to say about Rabbi Eliezer, and so therefore I understand that he would be going like Rabbeinu Hananel's understanding. The mere fact that the Rif quotes these Amoraim who discuss Rabbi Eliezer indicates that he held like Rabbeinu Hananel. Because if he didn't hold like Rabbeinu Hananel, he could have left that part of the Gemara out of his halachot.
Sure.
Yes.
How can the Amoraim overrule the decision of the Mishnah that the Chachamim don't agree with the Rabbi Eliezer?
So this gets a little bit into Klalei Shas. Sometimes the assumption would be that there was a Masorah that in this case or that case, that the halacha, let's say here, is like Rabbi Eliezer, even though generally it's not like Rabbi Eliezer neged Chachamim. So they have some kind of Masorah that would indicate that. So they're not overruling the Mishnah. But think about it this way: when we break up halacha into these historical periods, the historical periods are relevant for the way we understand the hierarchy of halacha and the way halacha is pasked. So there is this idea that Amoraim cannot overrule Tanaim writ large. They can't overrule Tanaim, but what they can do is they can discuss Tanaim, and depending on the way they learned, or depending on the way they had a Masorah, they can determine which Tana to hold by. So we see this in many other instances, even Deyot that are not brought in the Mishnah, but maybe brought in a Braita, where an Amora will say that he holds like an opinion of a Tana from the Braita, even though it's not in the Mishnah at all, but that's still a legitimate source. And maybe that was the way it came down to him. In a similar vein, this pattern kind of repeats itself in history, because there's also a tacit understanding that Achronim can't overrule Rishonim. So, but you do have this phenomenon of different Achronim that might disagree with each other, because one will hold like one Rishon as opposed to another Rishon, right? So that it's a similar kind of thing. So once we have Chatimat Mishnah, once we have the redaction of the Mishnah, and then in that same generation, we also have the collections of the Tanaim, the Tosefta and the Midrashei Halacha are also redacted. So after that time, Amoraim are no longer in the mix. I will just say in brackets, there seem to be a couple of exceptions to that. which are a little obscure for our discussion, but we have famously the Gemara in a couple of places says of Rav, when Rav, who's the first generation Amorah and one of the Talmidim of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, where Rav seems to be disagreeing with the Tana, and we don't have another source for him. There is a Gemara that says Rav Tanahu Upalik. Rav himself was a Tana, and he disagreed, and he could disagree. In other words, Rav still was considered to be a Tana. So, in the same, now it doesn't happen often. I think I don't have enough Vikiyut and Shas to tell you, but I think it happens 2 or maybe 3 times where the Gemara says that, and it doesn't say it in every possible place, but there is that idea. And we have, similarly, we have Achronim that will disagree with certain Rishonim that had come to be accepted on a given halacha. So we don't have a klal that says so and so is a Rishon and who cholek, but it was considered. We think of it in a similar way. Famously, the Gra would sometimes disagree with popular opinion as it came down by the later Rishonim or by the time of the Beit Yosef. Sometimes he would disagree. But the Gra was the Gra, so everybody recognized that the Gra was enough of an authority that he could make such a statement. Not many Achronim are in that category. There are other examples, though, in the other shir that I give in Sofrut. There's a really interesting example of that from the Ramame Fano, Rav Menachem Azaria from Fano in Italy, who was like a generation or 2 after the Shulchan Aruch, where he says some extremely bold things, including on occasion he would also fix what he thought were mistakes in the Girsa of the Gemara itself, and come to conclusions that ran counter to some other popular opinions. But to do that, it's not an arbitrary thing, right? So these are people who are Talmidei Chachamim of such stature that we understand that they don't just say it on a whim, they say it after deep analysis. In any event, just a little bit of insight into Klalei Psak. So at the end of this Ran, what we say is what he concludes, what he seems to conclude, is that halacha is in fact like Rabbi Eliezer, both because this is how Rabbeinu Hananel understands, and also the Rif and also the Rambam. So this is, now I'll just point out, and this is a good case to point it out. The Rif learned, he was a Talmud in the yeshiva. Now I just looked this up recently, for some reason I can't keep this in my head. I don't remember if he directly learned from Rabbeinu Hananel or if he was a generation after Rabbeinu Hananel. But the Rif learned in the same yeshiva of Rabbeinu Hananel in North Africa, meaning when one of the things we find when we learn the Rif, if you learn the Rif and if you learn Rabbeinu Hananel and the Rif and the Rambam, they are often in agreement, because the Rabbeinu Hananel, who's like the end of the Tkufat HaGaonim, summarized in his Perush, he summarizes the way people learned then in North Africa, the way they understood things, including also their Girsan, the Gemara, and the Rif as a general rule, follows the Rabbeinu Hananel. And the Rambam, as a general rule, follows the Rif, who by then was also living in North Africa, but he saw the Rif, as I'm sure I've mentioned many times here, as the greatest of the poskim. So there are very few cases where the Rambam doesn't agree with the Rif. So that takes care of that for the moment. Now he's going to talk a little bit more about Chaya. L'inyan Chaya, lo itparesh b'Gemara ademat mikre Chaya lenirata sandal. So the Gemara doesn't tell us explicitly until what time a woman is considered to be a Chaya, that we call her a Chaya for this purpose of wearing leather shoes on Yom Kippur. So a woman gives birth, so she's allowed to wear leather shoes on Yom Kippur. So how long does she have that status for? That's the question. So here in this Gemara, it doesn't say. So now we have to figure it out. Mistaber ad shloshim yom. It would make sense to say ad shloshim yom. So not arbitrarily, but why? Lefi shekol hazman hazeh hatzina kashela. Because for the first 30 days, for all of this time, cold, exposure to the cold is hard for her. Kedamrin beperek mifanim. Like we say in Perek Mifanim, L'chaya ad shoshim yom. So this is where we're going to digress a little bit. Let's look at the Gemara that he's talking about, and you'll see, and then we'll go back to the Ran to see how he puts it together. So actually, I started over here to give everybody a little bit of context. We have the Mishnah in Perek Yud Chet of Shabbat, which begins with the Mishnah. It's called Perek Mifanim, and it talks about, in the first Mishnah, it's talking about things that you're allowed to move around on Shabbat, despite the fact that normally, even things that aren't muktzah, you're not supposed to just move things around. It's like it would be like moving furniture. Like you don't move things around on Shabbat if you don't need to, like heavy types of things because of the tircha, right? You're not supposed to trouble yourself about things like this on Shabbat. But there are exceptions. If there's a good reason to do it, then there are exceptions. That's not immediately relevant, so we're going to skip that. And then the Mishnah goes into another area of halacha. The Mishnah says, "Ein bi'aldinata behema b'yom tov." We don't help an animal to give birth on Yom Tov. Meaning, so let's say you have a cow. The cow is giving birth. So we don't help it to give birth. What does it mean to help it to give birth? So like the Bartanura says, "Ein lo shchina tavalad min harechem b'yom tov te'ika tircha yetera." So we don't actually pull the calf out of the cow. We don't pull the animal out of an animal that's giving birth on Yom Tov, because that's considered to be a tircha, and even on Yom Tov, it's not permitted, right? So we're talking in the first part of the parak, as I say, we're talking about Nyanei tircha, things that you don't do on Shabbos because of tircha.
I'm actually a bit surprised about this. I would think that Tsaras Balei Chaim would apply here.
So we'll see. So Amy Aldina in Moshchina Tavalad min Rechem b'Yom Tov te'ika tircha yetera. That's too much tircha. It's an excessive amount of tircha. Umi Aldina ta'isha. By contrast, we do help a woman give birth on Shabbat. In other words, even on Shabbat. right? So the behema, we'll see in the Gemara. Actually, yeah, I guess we can look at that part. We'll see in the Gemara that the Gemara, there's a bright on the Gemara says that we ein miyaldina, which we don't actually birth the animal, but misa'adinoto, we help it. There's ways of helping it without tircha yetera. The Gemara describes that. But by the isha, mialdin, right? So isha is different. Mialdina ta isha. The Shabbat, the Korim la Chachama Minakom. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, not just in the Brayta, but here, Aval Misadim, right? The Mishnah says, but we help the animal to give birth. And so, what does it say? So the Bartanur says, what does it mean? Misadin. Ochezet avalad shelo yipol la'aretz. We hold on to the animal, or so we don't pull it, but we hold on to it so it doesn't just fall out. And the Gemara describes some other things, right? So I'm not much of an expert on animal husbandry, but there are certain things that they would do at the time, and maybe even now, I don't know, but they would help the animal to be born. But for a Shah, Yaldin, in other words, you before you do the actual birth. So in other words, if the baby is coming out, so then it's permitted to help the baby to come out, to actually hold on to the baby, to help the baby come out even on Shabbat. But not only that, the Korim la Chachama Minakom Lemakom. We call her a Chachama is a midwife in this context. We call her a midwife to come from place to place. What does it mean from place to place on Shabbat? What would that imply?
So beyond the what's the term?
You have it.
Beyond the distance beyond the nearest settlement.
Very good. Okay, so beyond the tchum. Okay, not necessarily the nearest settlement, but outside of the tchum Shabbat. If a woman is in labor and you need a professional midwife, then you can go and call on a midwife to come even from outside of the tchum to help her to give birth. Umechalin aleha to Shabbat, and we even violate the Shabbat for her, for the woman who's giving birth. The koshrina tabur, and we also tie up the umbilical cord. Rabbi Yossi Amir af chotchin. Rabbi Yossi says we even cut the umbilical cord. The chol tzarchei milah osim b'Shabbat, and all of the things that are necessary to do milah we do on Shabbat. That's the end of this parak, and then the next parak talks about brit milah on Shabbat. So, what does it mean? We don't worry about isur tchumin. And mechalina le'almenta Shabbat mishashi yoshevet al mashber. So I'm going to skip the Bartanura because we're going to look into the Gemara. The Bartanura is basing himself here on the Gemara. So let's look at the Gemara. And we'll see. One of the reasons I'm digressing on this, I could summarize this in a few sentences, but I just think it's worthwhile to know, because it also has to do, first of all, it's just worthwhile anyway, but it will also give us some insight into when we're Mechalel Shabbat for a Choleh or a Cholah. And the Chaya has a status of a Cholah, and the Chaya is a good example because depending on how much time we're talking about since the time of birth, her status changes based on general rules, right? So this is the mission that we just looked at. And here's the Gemara. We'll read through the first part of the Gemara anyway. I was going to skip it, but since we started to talk about it, Ketzad Misadin. So how do you help an animal to give birth? Rav Yehuda Amar Ochezet Avalad Shelo Yipol La'aretz. So this is where the Bartanura gets his comment. Rav Yehuda says that you hold on to the calf or the animal that's being born so that it doesn't fall to the ground. Rav Nachman Amar Dochek v'basar kadesh yitzei avad. Nachman says you push away at the flesh in order for the lad to come out. In other words, as I understand it, would be like to push out, the opening of the womb. In order to make it easier for the animal to come out. Tanya kavati to Rabbi Yehuda ketzad misadino chazina tavad shali pol haaretz v'nofech lo b'chot mo v'noten lo dad l'toch piv kedei sheyinak. Right, so we have a brayta that goes like Rabbi Yehuda, who said that you hold on to the animal so it doesn't fall. So in the brayta it says the following things: that you can hold on to the animal so it doesn't fall. You can also blow into its nostrils, right, to get it to start breathing. And you can also put a teat in its mouth so that it starts to nurse, so it starts to suckle. Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Merachamim hayinu behimato Rabbi Yom Tov. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that we were you would understand this to be like we were compassionate about an animal, and a behemat tahora, right? So there was a kosher animal on Yom Tov. Rashi here actually says, just a second. Says not Merachamim the way you would think. Ma'ahavin et v'lada aleha. The Merachamim here, it would be like I think you'd have to. I think the nikud would be marchamim. That is, it's a causative. We make the mother like or love the child. It's not that we are compassionate, that we make the mother like the child. Rashi says, we make the mother love the child, like the child. So how did they do that? That's what the Gemara says. How is that done? Amar Abaye. This sounds quite strange, and I've never talked to anybody who would know something about it, but this is what the Gemara said. This seemed to be common wisdom at the time. Amar Abaye mevi bul shel melach meiniach la betoch harechem. They would bring a block of salt and put it into her womb. Kedesh tizkor tza'ara u'trachem alav, so that she would remember the pain that she went through of childbirth. That would make her, that would endear her to the child. It was after she went all that trouble that she would want to support the child. We'd also take the water from the afterbirth, and we would sprinkle it on the child, so that the mother would smell from the shilya, and also that would endear her to the child. The dafka tahora, and we'd only do that for behemat tahora, about tameya lo, but they wouldn't do it for behemat tameya. And of course, on a typical farm, you would have both, right? Because you'll have the animals that you're raising, like a cow or a goat or sheep. But you also could have a horse or a donkey or a camel or something like that. So these are things that they would do for behemat tahora, but not for behemat tameya. What's the reason? This is a very interesting thing. Tameya Lo marachka valda. The general reality was that a behemat tameya will not distance itself from its child. In other words, so we don't have to do anything to make sure that the behemat tameya will take care of its child. If for some reason it does distance itself from its child, lo mekarva, it won't come back to be close to it. And that's just the way that the nature of a behemat tameya is that it will naturally take care of its child. And for whatever reason it doesn't, anything that we do is not going to change that. So we'll only do things that are tircha of one sort or another on Yom Tov to help a behemat tahora. Okay. Now the Gemara talks about a woman giving birth. Mialdina ta'isha v'chuli. Nichte tanale mialdina ta'isha. V'korin la chachama mimakom mimakom. Mechalina le'ata shabbat la'tu yemai. Right, so since the Mishnah says that we help the woman to give birth, and we even call a midwife to come from one place to another place, and it goes on to say that we're mechal Shabbos for her, what does that include? So what is that telling me that I didn't already know? In other words, once I say that I can bring the chachama mimakom lemakom, and I can help her explicitly to give birth, so then what does it tell me? What does it add if I tell you that it means that we're also mechal Shabbos for her? So the Gemara says that it comes to include this, which we learn in a Braita. If the woman who's giving birth needed a light on Shabbos, then her companion can light a light for her. In other words, they can light a lamp for her. If she needed oil, then her friend can bring oil in her hand, so she can carry from one reshut to another reshut on Shabbat. Sapak biyad, or if it's not enough oil that she could hold it in her hand, she can put oil in her hair to carry more oil and bring it in her hair. Sapak b'sara, if it's not enough oil that she can hold in her hair, she can even bring it in a kli, like she can fill up a vessel of one sort or another and bring the oil. So you notice there's this gradation. It starts off by bringing the oil in her hand. If that's not enough, she can bring it more in her hair. If that's not going to be enough, she can bring it in a kli. So why didn't we say just bring it in the kli to begin with? Because it says in Chalina la'ata Shabbat. Why do we have these other stages?
You shouldn't do more than necessary.
You don't do more than is necessary. So it's a concept that we've talked about before, that we're dochesh Shabbat, we push away Shabbat, mipnei acholeh, and mipnei sakanat nefashot. What does it mean to push away? It means that, like, we push away just enough to do whatever it is that's necessary. So if we can get by with less, then we do less, or we do it b'shinui. We do it in some way that's different than the way we would normally do it on chol, in order to minimize the amount of chilul Shabbat. So the Mishnah says, "Mechalina la'ata Shabbat." We're mechalel Shabbat for her, but we do it within a minimum kind of framework. Amar Mar.
Phil,
Yeah.
isn't the husband allowed to be present at when his wife gives birth? Because they just mentioned a chavera and not the husband himself.
Right.
I would think that the husband would be the first person to bring her something.
Well, I think so based on this, what would you say though? Apparently not. I
Yes.
think we're used to this idea nowadays, right? But look, even up till the late 20th century, it wasn't that common for husbands to be present at their wives' births. Traditionally, when the wife goes into labor, I think this is true across cultures around the world. You would bring the midwife. That would be the normal course of events.
The midwife is okay, or a doctor, but still the husband could be there.
Maybe the husband is there, right? But maybe not, right? So in halachically speaking, on the one hand, it's permitted for the husband to be there, but on the other hand, husband is technically not allowed to touch his wife once she goes into labor. That has to do with Hilchot Nida, even though she's not a Nida, but we won't get into it. It's a kind of a complicated area of halacha. There's a tshuva of Rav Moshe about it, actually, but he says that the husband's allowed to be there, but he's not there. He's limited in terms of what he can do. Also, having attended many births myself, on the one hand, this is just a personal thing, my wife very much wanted me to be there, but I wasn't necessarily the person that she wanted to do anything.
So she wanted you there, but she wanted you out of the way.
Kind of, yeah. And I don't know. I mean, you can take some informal polling and ask women. And I'm sure it's very individual, but it seems to me that the Gemara is just reflecting a cultural reality. That when a woman, and we'll see it a little bit further in the Gemara as well, when the woman was giving birth, she would basically be surrounded by women, especially women who had already given birth, most likely, because that's who you want. You want the experienced people with you. The husband, for better or for worse, never gave birth, so he's of limited help. So it's an interesting thing. So Amar Mar, so Amar Mar, meaning we're referring back to this Breita that we just brought. In that Breita, it said that if the woman is giving birth needed a lamp, then her friend can light a lamp for her. So where it says Pshita, obviously. In other words, we already said that you can be Mechalel Shabbat for her. So why does the Breita go out of its way to tell me that the friend can light her a lamp? I know that she can light a lamp. Lo tzricha besuma. We need the Breita to tell me in the case where the woman who's giving birth is blind. Mahu detema kevanda lochazia asur. What would you think? Since she can't see, it would be forbidden to light a lamp for her. So, why should we light a lamp for her? She can't see anyway. Kamash malan, yituve miyatva da'ata. We light it to put her at ease. Savra, because she'll think, because she'll say, if there is something, literally, if there is something, if there's something that I'll need, then my friend, she'll be able to see, and she can do it for me. So this is a chidush in Hilchot Shabbat generally, that even a woman, so this would also be true of a cholesh yesh bo sakana, who's blind. You would be allowed to light a lamp for them or let's say it opens up this possibility that you can do other things if they request that a light is lit. You can light it for them because the thinking is they want to make sure that whoever's attending them can see what they're doing. Im haytat tzricha l'shemen, so now we'll go on to the next part of the brain. So if she needed oil, so if she needed oil, then they can bring it in her. She can bring it in her hand, or she can bring it in her hair, and if not, she can bring it in the kli. But the middle case of bringing it in her hair, this needs some explanation. Tzipuk le mishum schita. So you should answer for it because of schita. In other words, there should be we should push back in a way against this idea that she should bring it in her hair. In other words, why is it permitted for her to bring it in her hair? Because how is she going to bring it in her hair? She's going to pour a lot of oil, like however much oil that her hair can absorb, and then she'll bring it back to the chaya, to the woman who's giving birth, and then she's going to squeeze it out. In order to make it usable, she has to squeeze it out. So why didn't you say that typically, so we have to understand what's the chidush there. The chidush would be because she's squeezing on Shabbat, and you're not allowed to squeeze on Shabbat. Rabba Rav Yosef Damri Tarvayo ain't schita b'seyar. So Rabba and Rav Yosef say that's not really the chidush, because schita, there is no schita by hair. This is not how we hold the halacha, but this is a deya in the Gemara. Rabba and Rav Yosef hold that there is no schita by the hair, and so the chidush of bringing in her hair is not that she's ultimately going to be squeezing it out. It's just that she'll be carrying it on Shabbat b'shinui. She'll be carrying it in a way that you don't normally carry things. Ravashi Amar afilu tema yesh schita b'seyar. Ravashi says, no, even if you say that the schita, that we do have schita by hair, miviyala b'kli derech sara. What the Braita means is not that she literally puts oil in her hair. It means that she brings a kli that's attached to her hair, which sounds weird. But the point is, the kamadev shad shnuye mishanina. The idea being that as much as we can change from the norm to be mechalel Shabbat for the chaya, we change it. Okay. This section was not immediately necessary, but I think it's important to see that Chachamim were give these rules, these gedarim, for to what extent one can be mechalel Shabbat for somebody who's in a medical state where they'll need a lot of help, or you're allowed to be mechalel Shabbat for them. But the general rule that we come out with is you're mechalel Shabbat for them only to the extent that you need to, and if you can change the way you are mechalel Shabbat for them, that in other words, if you can change the action that you're doing from the way you do it on Chol to be mechalel Shabbat for them, that's better than doing it explicitly. Of course, if it's necessary to do something explicitly, you do it explicitly. Okay, now we're getting closer to the topic at hand. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Chaya. Okay, so the chaya, the woman who's giving birth, kol zman shehakever patuach, bein amrat tzrichani, bein lo amrat tzrichani, mechalina le'at Shabbat. So a chaya, all the time that her womb is open, it's a kind of a funny turn of phrase, they call the womb here the kever. I saw a perush that said that I saw a perush today about a little bit of a source for that, but for whatever reason, it's a kind of an interesting turn of phrase, right? Because it's kind of it's like lashon sagin nahor. It's kind of the opposite of what you would think, because the womb,
tomb.
from womb to tomb, right? But the womb is the place for the generation of the child. And the kever is where we all end up eventually. We could talk about there's some interesting, when you think about it, there's some interesting parallels between the womb and the tomb, right? They're both dark places, and etc. But in any event, so
maybe it comes from they are afraid to use the Lashon Hara or something like that. Not Lashon Hara,
you
something
mean
which would say
like ayin hara.
Ayin Hara, yes. So they say the opposite.
Yeah, it could be. Actually, I hadn't thought of that, and I should have written this down because I don't have this book in front of me now. When I was at shul this morning, I saw a perush that relates it to Lashon HaMikra. There's a Lashon HaMikra that also relates the womb to the tomb. But in any event, actually, I think your idea of ayin hara or something like that might mamash really be shayach, because we see in so many places where we use this lashon sagin nahor when we don't want to say something explicitly. All right. In any event, a chaya, as long as the womb is open, bein amrat tzrichani, bein lo amrat tzrichani, v'chalin aleh Shabbat. All right. So as long as the womb is open, whether she says I need or whether she doesn't say I need, we're mechal Shabbos for her. Nistama kever, if the womb is closed, bein amra tzrichani, bein lo amra tzrichani, ein mechalin aleh Shabbat. Right. Once the womb is closed, whether she says I need or whether she doesn't say I need, we're no longer mechal Shabbos for her. Chad v'chalak, Rav Ashi matni hachi. That's how Rav Ashi learned. In other words, this ma'amar that we brought, this is the ma'amar of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, right? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. The way Rav Ashi learned that is the way we just said it. Mar Zutra, who was a contemporary of Rav Ashi, matni hachi, he learned that ma'amar differently. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Chaya kol zman shekever batzuach, bein amrat tzrichani, bein amrat ein tzrichani, v'chalin aleh Shabbat. So the first part is the same. As long as the womb is open, whether or not she says that she needs something which would be a chilul Shabbat, we're mechalel Shabbat for her. Nistama kever amrat tzrichani, once the womb is closed, if she says tzrichani, v'chalin aleh Shabbat. If she says explicitly, I need something, which would be a chilul Shabbat, then we're mechalel Shabbat for her. Lo amrat tzrichani, ein mechalin aleh Shabbat. Right? If she does not say I need something, then we're not mechal Shabbos for. So this is different than the way Rav Ashi learned. How is it different from Rav Ashi's learning? I'm sorry, I actually thought to lay this out the way I usually lay out things, but I didn't have the time. So in Rav Ashi's rendering, once the kever is satum, once the kever once the womb is closed up, we're not Mechal Shabbos for her at all. Whether she says I need something or I don't need something, or she doesn't say I need something. And according to Mar Zutra, the way he learns it is once the kever is closed, if she says I need something, then we are Mechal Shabbos. If she doesn't say I need something, we're not Mechal Shabbos. So that's the machloket then between Rav Ashi and Mar Zutra. What is the status? What do we do for a chaya on Shabbat once the kever is sagur, once the womb has closed? So Mar Zutra is mekil because he says if she says I need something, I'm still Mechal Shabbos for her. Rav Ashi is machmir because he says even if she says I need something, I'm not. Once the kever is closed, I no longer Mechal Shabbos for her. Amale Ravina leMereimar. So Ravina said to Mereimar, these are the very last generations of Amoraim. So Ravina says to Mereimar, Mar Zutra matni lekula, Rav Ashi matni lechumra, hilchata kaman. So he says, okay, Mar Zutra's mekil, Rav Ashi's machmir. Who do we hold halacha by? Marlei halacha kamar Zutra. Safek nefashot lahakel. We're going to hold like Mar Zutra because we have a general rule. Safek nefashot lahakel. Anytime there's a safek regarding someone's life, then we're mekil on Shabbat or for whatever the pertinent halacha is. So here also we see in this discussion of how we paskin halacha. This comes at the very end of the chronologically in the Gemara, because Rav Ashi and Mar Zutra are the last or the next to the last generation. Rav Ashi is generally credited as being the one who edits and puts together the Talmud Bavli as we know it. But we know that some of it came after. And we see that their students, Ravina and Mereimar, are discussing it. So in a machloka between it, so he doesn't say we hold like Mar Zutra because Allah is like Mar Zutra against Rav Ashi. He says we hold like Mar Zutra because he's mekil regarding Safek Nefashot. And we hold that generally, that we're mekil gabei safek nefashot. Okay, so now of course we have a simple question. So now we've differentiated between a woman who just gave birth, whose womb is open, and a woman sometime after she gave birth, when the womb is closed. So now we want to know, so how do we know when those times are? So first of all, when do we consider her womb to be open? When does that happen? Amar Abaye, so Abaye says it's from the time she sits on the mashber. The mashber is like the birthing stone, right? There was something that they would sit on or position themselves on. Women would position themselves on a mashber. This is what the word mashber really means, right? The mashber is where the woman gives birth. So the idea being that when a woman is actually in the throes of childbirth, she's going to sit on crouch, I'm not sure exactly how it worked, on the mashber in order to give birth. So when she gets to that point, then clearly the womb is open.
So am I correct in remembering that mashber in contemporary Hebrew means crisis?
Yes.
Okay, and okay.
So it comes from this idea of the mashber. It's there's a word for mashber in this context in English, which I'm guessing Michael Werner, but I can't remember. There's
I think we call it a birthing stool.
No, there's
I recall.
I know what you're saying. There's another word. There's like a classic word. It's like the something with travail or something. I don't know. Anyway, but it's when a woman is in her travail. It's when she's giving birth. Rav Huna bereder of Yeshua Amar. So that's what Abaye says. It's from the time she's actually in the physical position where she's giving birth. Rav Huna bereder of Yeshua Amar Mishasha Hadam Shotet V'Yored. They say it's from the time that the blood starts to trickle out and go down. V'amrila Mishasha Chavrotea Nosotota Ba'agapea. It's from the time, here again we see her friends, where her women friends are carrying her by her arms, right? So it's from, so it seems to, right, so each one of these seems to be, the mashber let's see, would be the latest. Blood could start coming out before she's actually ready to give birth. And she could also lose the capability of walking by herself even before that, right? She'll start to need help in walking. All right, so there's a machloket here about when exactly P'tichat HaKever is, but it's at some point when she's very close to giving birth, or she's imminently going to give birth. When I say imminently, I can say like the dam shotet and mishasha charotan nosotot ba'agapea. Truth is that could be like hours before she gives birth. I think mishasha tesheva amashver is much closer to the actual time she's going to give birth. But we can see that in halacha. I'm going to leave that for the moment. So that's one question. When does the womb open? So it's one of these times. Ad matai p'tichat hakever. So how long do we consider the womb to be open, right? Because now we know there's a difference in terms of the Chilul Shabbat I'll do for her once the womb is closed. Amar Abaye Shosha Yamim. He says we hold that the P'tichat HaKever lasts for 3 days. Rav Amar Mishmei de Rav Yehuda Shiva. He says for 7 days. We hold the womb to be open for 7 days. Some people say for 30 days. Amri Nahardai. The people in Nahardea said Chaya, Shosha, Shiva, Ushloshim. We talk about the Chaya. We have 3 time frames. One is 3, one is 7, and one is 30. In other words, the machloket we see between Abaye and Rava and the Amrila, they seem to be saying there's one answer to this question. Either it's open for 3 days, it's open for 7 days, or it's open for 30 days. The Nahardai said all 3 of those time frames are relevant, but they have different halachot. So a chaya is a chaya for 3 days, and for 7 days, for 30 days. So what's the difference? Shosha, bein amrat tzrichani, uvein amrat lo tzrichani, v'chalina le'at Shabbat. The first 3 days from the time she gives birth, or let's say, we say from P'tichat HaKever, so it's even before she gives birth, right? That's the machloket we had a moment ago. From whatever time we consider the birthing to begin, which could either be from the time she can no longer stand by herself, or from the time that blood is starting to come out of her, or from the time that she's actually in a position to give birth, one of those things. From that time, we're already Mechalel Shabbat for her. And then for 3 days after the birth, from 3 days after the birth, if she says, whether she says I need something or I don't need something, we're Mechal Shabbos for her. So let's just dwell on that for a moment. So if she says I need X, let's say I need you to light a candle for me on Shabbos. So obviously we do. But what does it mean, even if she says I don't need, we're still Mechal Shabbos for her. What does that mean? Why would we be Machal Shabbos for her if she says, I don't need you for you to be Mechal Shabbos.
The assumption is that either one of her companions will need something, or that at some point she will need or that she doesn't have the wherewithal to know what she needs, or she may need it in the future. In the
Okay,
immediate
well,
future.
let's dwell on the second thing mostly. In other words, the fact that she says, I don't need something, but if we know, in other words, if the people around her know that she does need something, then we don't care that she says, I don't need it. And we'll do it for her anyway.
Which is the case with any chole, besakanat nefesh.
So one of the reasons I'm doing this is because this is a source for this idea. We get it from this sugya, that we consider the chaya in the first 3 days to be a chola sheyesh basakana. And since she's in that category, then whether or not she thinks she needs something, if we think she needs something, then we do it for her, even if she says, I don't need it, right? Shosha bein amra tzrichani uvein amra lo tzrichani, even if she says, I don't need it, but other people say that she needs it. Who these other people are, this is discussion, right? But presumably people who know something about what she needs, then mechalina le'at Shabbat. Shiva, but so for the first week, amra tzrichani mechalina le'at Shabbat, amra lo tzrichani ein mechalina le'at Shabbat. So now the next stage would be Shiva. So what is the Shiva? What days are the Shiva? So we have the Shosha is from the time she gives birth for 3 days. Now I say Shiva. What's Shiva? What am I counting Shiva from? 7 days from when?
I would
There could be two
guess.
Michael Schwartz, what'd you say?
There could be two possibilities, either 7 days from the birth or 7 days after the initial 3 days. I would think it'd be the latter. It would make more sense.
And Michael Myrna, what did you want to say?
I was going to say more likely the former.
More likely the former. So we'll see later on from the Gemara, it's the former. In other words, the idea of the 3, 7, and 30 is it's a 30-day period. And the first 3 days have this status. Then from day 4 to day 7 have this status. And then from day 8 till day 30 has another status. So that's the status for Shiva. If she says, I need something, Mechal Shabbos for her. If she says, I don't need something, we're not Mechal Shabbos for her. Shloshim, afilu amra tzrichani, even if she says, I need something, which we know that's in the 2 prior cases, that's dochet hakol, right? If she says, I need something during the first 3 days or even during the first 7 days, if she says, I need something on Shabbat, we're Mechal Shabbos for her. But this latter period of the Shloshim, if she says, even if she says, I need something, we're not Mechal Shabbos for her. We do it we'll do it for her, we'll have Mechal Shabbos for her through literally an Aramite, through a non-Jew. Right, so because what's the general rule? You're not allowed to tell a non-Jew on Shabbat to be Mechalel Shabbat for you. But this would be an exception. That if the Chaya during the Shoshim says, I need something that would be a Chilul Shabbat, then you can explicitly tell a non-Jew to do it. K'deravula bered Rav Yilai, like Ravula, the son of Rav Yilai, said, Da'amar, Chol tzarchei choleh, the asin al yedei aramayi b'Shabbat. all the needs of a chole are done by way of a non-Jew on Shabbat. We could Rav Hamnuna, and also like Rav Hamnuna, Rav Hamnuna, davar she'ein bo sakana omer lenochri ve'oseh. Something that would be a chilul Shabbat for a chole she'ein bo sakana is what he means. You're allowed, so somebody who's a chole, but he's not in danger of dying. Then you can tell a non-Jew explicitly to do it on Shabbat. So now we'll go a little bit further. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel l'chaya 30 yom. L'may hilchata, right? So l'chaya is a chaya for 30 days. L'may hilchata Amri nahardai l'tvila. So they said in Nahardaya for tvila. Amar Rava lo amran ela shein ba'ala ima. So what does it mean, the tvila, which is a chaya for 30 days, linyan tvila? It's a little right. It doesn't tell us exactly what that means. What does it mean? She's a chaya for tvila. What does that mean? Let's read a little bit further. And we'll get it from the context. Amar Rava lo amran ela shein ba'ala ima, ava ba'ala ima ba'ala mechamama. So Rava says that they only said that she's a chaya for tefillah for 30 days in the case where her husband wasn't with her. But if her husband was with her, then her husband will warm her up. Kihad, and then they bring a little story, a little anecdote. Kihad brate de Rav Chisda, like the daughter of Rav Chisda, who was married to Rava. Her husband was Rava. The daughter of Rav Chisda, Tavla begot Latin Yomin, she tabled, right? She went to the mikveh during the first 30 days after she gave birth, Shelo bifnei ba'ala, not in front of her husband. In other words, when her husband wasn't there, v'itz demiyat, and she got cold. Bamtui la'arsa batre de Rava le'pumpadita, and then they had to bring her in her bed to Rava, who was in Pumpadita. So what does it mean that she's a chaya li'inyan tvila? What are we worried about if she doubles? We're worried that she'll get cold. And what's the problem with getting cold? Because if you get cold, you can get sick. It's a danger. And a chaya, so the idea here is a chaya, we started off here, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, chaya 30 yom. For a chaya, she's a chaya for 30 days. The Gemara wants to know what's the point of saying she's a chaya for 30 days? That why did Shmuel say this? So they said the tvila, she's a chaya l'inyan tvila, meaning what? That she shouldn't tavel during the first 30 days. Because if she tavels, she could get cold and she could get very ill. Right? So back then, not everybody had heated mikvahs. And you can imagine if a woman who had to tavel, or even a man, anyone who had to tavel the mehag shamim, right, during the winter months, it would be a very cold experience, right? Because you're taveling in rainwater in the winter, and it's pretty cold. I had a cold mikveh here for the last couple of days because the heater broke, but I just got a new heater and heating it up. Anyway, So for me, it's just a discomfort, but for a woman who just gave birth, it was considered to be a real danger, right? That a woman in that situation should not get so cold. So Rava says, what does it mean, Litzvila? Nardai says Litzvila, that you're not allowed to, she's really not allowed to tabel during that time. Rava said they only said that she shouldn't tabel as long as her husband isn't with her. But if her husband is with her, then her husband will warm her up. In other words, so why does a woman go to tabel? There actually, even though nowadays there's only one real reason for the woman to go tabel, one halachic reason, is so that she's muteret leba'ala, right? So that she can engage in conjugal relations. But at earlier times, there was another reason a woman might tabel. What's another reason for a woman to tabel?
She had to bring a korban.
She had to bring a court, or even if she was just mitaseket b'taharot. In other words, at a time when people were careful about eating foods that was tahor, which might have been for the Beit HaMikdash, but even after Churban Bayit, there were people that kept Dinei Taharot as a level of tahara, right? As a level of kedusha, they would keep inyanim of taharot. So, let's say people who would not eat their food unless it was tahor, or certainly if they were a kohen, they would still eat, and they had to eat. They wanted to eat truma. So even after Qurban Bayit, a kohen could get truma, but he can only eat it if the truma itself is tahor, not tameh. So women or men who would process food in whatever form they had to be themselves tahor. So a woman might tavel either leba'al, like according to the Gemara Zashon, it's either leba'ala or letaharot. So here it doesn't say which is which, but the idea, but you might ask, when Rava says lo amran el shein ba'ala ima, they only said that she shouldn't tavel when her husband isn't with her. So you'll say, why didn't she tavel at all if her husband isn't with her? She might have tavel because she had to take care of some food, some grain or some fruits or whatever, and maybe she wanted to tavel so that she would be tahora to take care of that. But if her husband is with her, she'll have relations with her husband, and that will warm her up. She'll be next to a warm body that will warm her up. And then we bring an actual anecdote where that happened, right? With the daughter of Rav Chisda, who was married to Rabbah, that she went ahead and tabled while she was still in her 30 days as a chaya, and she got very cold, and they had to bring her to her husband to warm her up. It's 9 o'clock. Let's read a little bit more about it. We're going to have to pick this up next time, and then we'll see how this fits back into Hilchot Yoma Kippurim. In other words, in Yoma we had this question, right? So the Mishnah says that chaya is allowed to wear shoes. So now the question is, what's a chaya for this purpose? Now, and so now we understand, at this point in the Gemara, we understand the definition of chaya varies according to how far away she is from giving birth. She's a chaya for 3 days, for 7 days, and for 30 days. So that's something that we'll have to bring up again next week. You know what? We'll stop here. We'll finish the sugya next time, and then we'll go back and we'll see this in the Ran. And now we have a better idea of what the chaya does. What the definition of chaya is or could be. And toch kedei, among other things that we learned, we start to understand that there are different categories of a choleh. And the exemplar is the chaya, because she goes in these stages from being in great danger to less danger to even less danger. So Adkan, any last questions or? Shabbat shalom. See you next week.
Thanks. Good night.
Shabbat shalom. Good night.
Bye-bye.